All right, good afternoon. In a short while, I will be joined by Richard College, the editor of the UNFPA State of the World Population Report 2017 edition. He will brief you on the launch of the report entitled Worlds Apart, Reproductive Health and Rights in an Age of Inequality. And before we do get to Richard, after we're done with my questions, we'll have Brendan brief you on behalf of the President of this General Assembly. The Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeffrey Feltman, just concluded a 5-day visit to Myanmar today. In Yangon and Naypyidaw, he met with State Councilor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and with Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, among other officials, as well as representatives of Myanmar civil society. Most of Mr. Feltman's discussion focused on the situation in Rakhine State and the plight of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who have fled into Bangladesh in the aftermath of the August 25th attacks on security positions and subsequent military action. Mr. Feltman reiterated the Secretary General's call that aid workers be given full and unhindered access to northern Rakhine State and that refugees be allowed voluntary, safe, and dignified return to their place of origin. Acknowledging the announcements by the government of Myanmar in addressing humanitarian concerns in Rakhine State and the return of refugees from Bangladesh, Mr. Feltman encouraged the authorities to utilize their capacities, best practices, and extensive experience of the United Nations to help assure that stated intentions could be implemented in a timely and effective manner. In northern Rakhine State, Mr. Feltman saw dozens of burnt and destroyed villages by air and visited several communities affected by recent violence. He also visited internally displaced persons camps outside of Sittwe that were set up in 2012. He saw how, in addition to the documented endemic discrimination against the Rohingya population, socioeconomic challenges adversely affect all communities in Rakhine State. In his talks with leaders of the armed forces, Mr. Feltman noted that the UN's experience, successful counterterrorism efforts do not rely exclusively on security measures, stressing the importance of accountability and non-discriminatory rule of law and public safety as part of a comprehensive approach needed to address the fears and distrust among the communities in Rakhine State. The UN is committed to supporting the Myanmar and Bangladesh in their efforts to find a sustainable solution to the plight of refugees and people affected by recent violence and mass displacement. You can read more about Mr. Feltman's trip in a note to correspondence we shall be issuing shortly. And over the border in Bangladesh, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that the number of Rohingya refugees who have fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh since August 25th has now reached 582,000 people. And that jump from yesterday, I think we had given you a number of 537,000. The jump is due to the number of the strengthened assessment of people coming across the border. Meanwhile, the UN Refugee Agency says today it's concerned about the thousands of newly arrived refugees stranded in Bangladesh near its border with Myanmar. Since Sunday evening, up to 15,000 refugees have entered Bangladesh. Many of them say they had initially chosen to stay in their home in Myanmar's northern Rakhine State despite repeated threats to leave or be killed, and finally fled when their villages were set on fire. Many of the refugees are still waiting for permission to move away from the border. The agency is advocating with Bangladesh authorities to urgently admit these people. The World Health Organization says that in the first phase of its joint oral cholera vaccine campaign with the government and UNICEF in Cox's Bazar, nearly 680,000 people over the age of 1 have been covered. The second phase of the campaign, the second largest ever of its kind, will begin on August 31st. For its part, the UNICEF today warned that without immediate additional funding, it will not be able to continue providing life-saving aid and protection to Rohingya children. Nearly 60% of the refugees who have fled Myanmar since August 25th are children. The growing needs are fast outpacing resources, as we're telling you, with the agency having received just 7% of the $76 million it needs to, among other activities, treat and treat water and truck water to 40,000 people, procure 15,000 children suffering from acute severe malnutrition, and help unaccompanied and separated children. Meanwhile, the director of the UN Migration Agency is in Bangladesh, Bill Swing, where he visited camps and met with officials. The government, IOM, and other agencies are working to set up a new 3,000-acre camp. Turning to Syria, we are aware of reports that the Syrian Democratic Forces have taken full control of Raqqa city, with the last remaining civilians evacuated in the past few days. The UN, however, is not in a position to verify firsthand the situation in the city due to lack of access, but we have received reports that much of the city has been damaged or destroyed due to the fighting. We're closely monitoring the situation and stand by to deliver life-saving assistance to those in need as soon as access is granted and security conditions permitted. The overall humanitarian and protection situation for civilians, including those who were displaced, remains of high concern in Raqqa Governorate and more broadly across northeastern Syria. Already, the UN and its partners have reached 330,000 men, women, and children in need across the area each month, including 56,000 people in 48 temporary shelters and camps in Raqqa, Al-Hasake, Aleppo, and Deir ez-Zor governorates. And over to the east in Iraq, our humanitarian colleagues tell us there's been no major displacement of civilians since yesterday's advances by the Iraqi military in Kirkuk. Some people are returning to Kirkuk, but we cannot define the exact numbers. In the past 48 hours, the UN Migration Agency says that some 61,000 people had left Kirkuk and surrounding areas, most of them heading north and east towards Erbil and Sulaymaniyah governorates. Aid workers are providing assistance where needed and can reach all of those in need. They call on all parties to ensure that civilians are protected and can leave affected areas if they choose. And we are working for you on possibly having Lise Grande tomorrow piped in here so you can ask her firsthand about the humanitarian situation in Iraq. And in Somalia, our World Health Organization colleagues have been delivering life-saving blood supplies and trauma care medicines as part of the emergency response to the bombings in Mogadishu. The supply include blood groups, testing kits, drug supplies, first aid medicines, and medical supplies to hospitals. WHO is also supporting the Ministry of Health and Human Services with emergency health kits to respond to common illness needs of 10,000 people for a duration of 3 months. Additional supplies are being pre-positioned for deployment as needed, and I know our colleagues at the UN mission in Somalia are also participating in a blood drive. Turning to Libya, our colleagues at IOM say that in the aftermath of weeks of conflict in SABRATHA, they are providing support to more than 14,000 migrants previously held in numerous informal detention centers and camps. Since the outbreak of the crisis, more than 6,700 people have received relief packages, which include mattresses, blankets, pillows, hygiene kits at 6 separate locations, and more than 100,000 meals have been provided in Zuwara and Sabratha. The UN Migration Agency has also responded to the vast health needs and conducted more than 1,600 medical interventions. The agency is concerned about the large number of migrants transferred to detention and strongly is advocating for alternatives. For its part, the UN Refugee Agency has delivered more than 15 truckloads of relief items, including sleeping mats, mattresses, blankets, hygiene kits, and winter jackets. The UNHCR colleagues on the front lines describe a picture of human suffering and abuse on a shocking scale. Among the refugees and migrants who suffered abuse at the hands of smugglers, there are pregnant women and newborn babies. Scores of them are in need of urgent medical care, with some suffering from bullet wounds and other visible signs of abuse. Most of them say they are subjected to numerous human rights abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence, forced labor, and sexual exploitation. And back here, the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, briefed the Security Council in South Sudan this morning. He said the security and human rights situation in the country remain extremely concerning. Within the tense environment, The government and security institutions and opposition forces continue to restrict the UN's mission's freedom of movement. It added that despite highly effective humanitarian operation, without a reduction in conflict and improved access, humanitarian indicators are likely to continue to deteriorate. With regard to the political process, Mr. Lacroix said the conflict is a direct outcome of a prolonged, disproportionate access to power and wealth. He said that all future dispensations must therefore rest on the principle of inclusivity that leads to equitable power and wealth sharing. And the head of the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, Irena Bokova, today condemned the killing yesterday of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. She welcomed the pledge by the Prime Minister of Malta to bring justice to this crime committed not just against a person, but against the right of freedom of expression and freedom of information, which are essential to democracies everywhere. And our friends at the UN Environment Programme today announced a $1 billion partnership with Rabobank, a Dutch bank based in Utrecht, to support climate-smart agriculture. The partnership consists of creation of new facilities to provide grants and credits to clients involved in sustainable agricultural production, processing, or the trade of commodities who adhere to strict provisions for forest protection, restoration, and involvement of small landholders. More information on UNEP's website. Yesterday, you will see we issued a statement from the Secretary General welcoming the establishment of the UN Mission for Justice Support in Haiti, MINUJUST, following the end of its predecessing mission, MINUSTA. And also yesterday, we issued a statement from the Secretary General, which he welcomed the summit held yesterday in Geneva between the President of the Republic of Armenia and the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, organized under the auspices of the OSCE Minsk Group. The Secretary General said he was encouraged by the President's agreement to take measure to intensify the negotiating process and take additional steps to reduce tensions along the line of contact. That statement was online. We're getting to the end of this, I promise. Today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. This year's theme is Answer the Call of October 17th to End Poverty, a path towards peaceful and inclusive societies. In a video message to mark the day, the Secretary General called on countries to redouble efforts to eradicate poverty in its entirety by working to achieve the 2030 Development Agenda. In particular, he called for addressing the root causes of poverty and in doing so to listen to the views and guidance of people living in poverty and acting together with them. Tomorrow, a number of press encounters. 9:45, Ambassador Danny Danon of Israel will speak to you at the Security Council stakeout. 12:15, there'll be a press briefing here by senior officials on Africa Week 2017. This year's theme is Supporting an Integrated, Prosperous, People-Centered and Peaceful Africa towards the implementation of Agenda 2063 and 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And at 1 p.m., we expect the Secretary General of these United Nations to speak to you also at the Security Council stakeout on upcoming travel. And if that stakeout is confirmed, we will not have a noon briefing, since when the boss speaks, the spokesman doesn't need to speak. Sir.
Thank you. On Mr. Feltman visit, you said they're going to be press statement or note to the correspondent.
Well, I mean, I read to you the bulk and the meat of the note to correspondence.
Yeah. Is he going to write a report somehow to his boss, and then it's going to be shared with...
Well, he's obviously is in touch with the Secretary General. We will see if there's any request for any briefing to the Security Council, which I'm not aware that there is at this point.
You mentioned every day, by the way, there is number of refugees fled Rakhine state to Bangladesh. Is there any number about victims? How many victims so far died? Because you said many. Normally, we hear the news like many villages being burned, many people being killed. What is the the official or the report figure? How many people have been killed in Rakhine state since the crisis started?
We do not have those numbers for the reason that we do not have access free and unfettered access for humanitarian colleagues in Rakhine State. Mr. Feltman went on a tour today, organized by the government of Myanmar. He reported what he saw, which is basically seen from the air, burnt out villages, and he made other observations. But we have no way of giving you any confirmed numbers. Madame, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you, Stéphane. The Venezuelan government had elections, local elections on Sunday, and the international community has had different reactions. The American government has said that, actually Ambassador Haley said that it's a need to have an audit on the elections. The opposition has claimed that it's been manipulation of the results. The Venezuelan government says that were clear and transparent. What is the United Nations reaction to all this controversy now?
Well, we have no specific comment on the elections, as we were not an observer, part of organizing. So we have no way to emit any sort of opinion on the technicalities of how the elections were held. The Secretary General's position on the need for dialogue and his support for the international mediation stands. Matthew, and then Madame.
Sure, I wanted to ask you about Myanmar, and I'm sorry I missed the first part of what you were saying, but I'm reading the note to correspondence. Did you address this idea of the replacement, either resident coordinator or an assistant secretary general? And on that, I wanted to ask whether you would confirm or deny that the UN proposed Mr. Magdi Martinez Soliman of UNDP as Assistant Secretary General, Myanmar, and if so, what the government's response was.
No, as you know, we announce replacements when they're official, whether it's senior appointments, RCs, or whatever. There are always rumors and things flying around, so I'm not going to start commenting on names that may or may not have been floated. As we mentioned, Ms. Locke-Dessalines will be leaving at the end of the month. When we have a replacement to announce, we shall do so.
But in this long note to correspondence, is it fair to say that this was one of the topics? And if so, where does it stand?
Well, as I said, we will announce a replacement when we're ready to announce. As with every resident coordinator, not just in Myanmar, in every country there's a resident coordinator. Mm-hmm. There needs to be an agreement with the government for that person. So when we're ready to announce, we will do this.
And can we get a similar? This note to correspondence is long. It looks great. Can we get a similar one for example, Mr. Kohler's visits to Morocco, Tindouf, and elsewhere?
Well, Mr. Kohler's currently in Rabat. We hope to have more at the conclusion of the visit. Madame.
Stéphane, just
Madame, and then go ahead.
It seems like Jeffrey Feltman came back pretty empty-handed. I mean, there's nothing in that statement that indicates any progress. Specifically on the issue of humanitarian access, what is the reason for blocking it at this point?
Well, I think that's a valid question to ask to the authorities of Myanmar. I don't think in announcing the trip we had expected any quick wins. This is an ongoing discussion with the government of Myanmar. It is one we're having publicly and one we're having privately. We would like to see that access as soon as possible. Mr. Klein. If you want to lead to the democracy in this room is just overwhelming with
Okay.
quality.
My question is, when you read out your statement regarding the situation in Raqqa, I believe you said
in Raqqa. Yeah.
Raqqa, yes.
Yeah.
I believe you said the UN was not in a position to independently verify the current status. But do you have any information you can share regarding the situation involving civilians in the last number of days, and reports that there was a deal worked out to allow some of the Islamist militants to leave Raqqa, mostly Syrian jihadists, in return for some protection of civilians? Can you comment on that?
No, we've seen the press reports on these deals. It's not something we were involved in any way, shape, or form. What we do know is that there have been we've seen reports in the past weeks of just a heavy casualty toll of civilians during the fight to retake Raqqa. Evelyn, was that the same question?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing.
Okay.
Anyway, I saw the UNICEF press release on how they're running out of money. Is everyone, the agencies competing with each other? UNHCR, who, UNICEF, to take care
I think
of the Bangladesh?
every agency has a particular mandate to fulfill. There will be, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a pledging conference soon, and then
For all of them.
Yes, so the resources are then appropriated.
Because it doesn't make sense, does it?
I try not to answer questions about what makes sense or doesn't make sense in this organization. Oleg, makes sense.
Thanks. On Raqqa again, you said that there is no access to the city. Have you requested one? And who are you going to send this request to? Are you in contact with the democratic forces, or are you?
Well, as with every situation in Syria, where who controls what area can be a little complex and manning of checkpoints. We have our colleagues on the ground have contact with whoever they need to on the ground, the de facto people who control these areas. And obviously, we are always trying to get access to places we're not able to get access to. Yeah? Yeah.
Because there were some reports that the Raqqa, the territory of Raqqa is going to be governed by the civilian administration. That's what it was called by the democratic forces. Were there any attempts to approach?
As I said, we're in touch with various parties on the ground to get that access. Luke?
A little different direction on Raqqa. I know it's hard and not really the UN's job to verify at the moment that the city falls, but let's say it's today or tomorrow or Saturday. We're at the end of the caliphate, it seems like, something that's been the source of a lot of global anxiety for years now. Is there sort of a broad comment the SG has on the importance of this moment?
I don't think we're in a position to say, especially from where I stand, are we at the end of the caliphate or are we not at the end of the caliphate? As you know, the security aspect of the fight against these extremist groups is not done by the United Nations. We are there on two areas. One is the humanitarian aspect, and obviously on the political reconciliation and peace aspect. So I think those questions are left to those who handle, I think, more security military matters. Jordan and Matthew.
Yeah, I know since there is no UN mission in Rakhine State, I assume that the plane was carrying Mr. Feltman was a military plane by the...
Well, I don't know if it was... I don't know what kind of helicopter he was in, but it was a government-sponsored trip. So, I mean, the UN was not piloting the aircraft.
And do you know who was with him on the plane?
Senior Myanmar officials.
And is it possible that Mr. Feltman come to speak to the press?
We will put in the request.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, Matthew and then Madame.
Sure. I'm going to ask you again about Cameroon. There are now reports of thousands of refugees having left the Anglophone areas into Nigeria. So since one of the UN sort of indicia of the seriousness of a problem is refugee flows, can you either comment on it? Can you find that out? And also, there's many people there are highly suspect of the belated visit to the area of Paul Biya's prime minister. And so I wonder, can you say, and can people continue to wonder what happened with the idea of a fall visit? Is it in some way tied to this? Is he waiting to see how that dialogue works?
Again, I think that's a question to ask the Cameroonian authorities.
Right.
We're in dialogue with them, and as always, the UN doesn't barge into places unless we have a Chapter 7 resolution. And so we're in discussions with the government, and like to hear a date for them for him to visit.
But you'd said earlier that it was just that you'd said that earlier they'd agreed, everything was fine, and so that's why people are now wondering.
Everything is agreed once everything is agreed. Carol.
Stéphane, just two questions, if I may. One, the SG's meeting with the Somalia minister today. Do you know if there'll be any press access to that, to the minister?
I think we'll probably do a photo op. I mean, the Secretary General requested to meet with him to present personally his condolences following this horrendous attack, and we've seen, the press reports we've all seen of the numbers rising, I think making it possibly one of the worst terrorist attacks in recent years anywhere. I mean, the numbers are staggering. So, I mean, for the Secretary General, who was in Somalia not too long ago, I think he really wanted to present his condolences and speak to the foreign minister, who's here, I think, for Africa Week.
Can I also ask about the JCPOA? The SG had said he would like it to remain in place. Is he doing anything towards that end? Is he talking to Congress?
I'm not aware of him having any specific contacts with members of Congress on this, but this is a message, again, that we're pushing both publicly and privately. Privately. Yeah.
I think the photo op already happened with Somalia, but I did want to ask you that he also met with the Bangladesh Speaker of the National Parliament. Is that going to be read out? Does it have to do with the Rohingya crisis?
I'll see what we can get out of the meeting.
And finally, is tomorrow, if he does a stakeout on travel, will he take questions? And I guess since I have no idea if he will take this one, I wanted to ask you about the Central African Republic. You've been willing here to confirm this one Mauritania case, or what Farhan said it was 16-year-old, not 19-year-old. But it turns out that there are other cases, but recent cases in MINUSCA involving peacekeepers from Morocco, Burundi, Pakistan. It seems like the problem is not over. They keep.
I don't think anyone, especially the UN, has ever said this problem is over. The Secretary General, if he does the stakeout, will take questions, and we have very little means of controlling what you will ask. Mr. Varma, to you, and then we'll have Richard speak. Go ahead.